Hello friends, welcome back to a new video. Today I wanted to share with you all the 5 Victorian classics that made me fall in love with Victorian literature. First sip of coffee of the day, much needed. Anyways, I hope you are all doing well. I hope this reading month has been amazing for each of you. For those of you participating in Victober, I of course want to know in the comments below what Victorian classic or classics really made you fall in love with Victorian literature. Is there any specific book that you feel was kind of the catalyst that made you a lover of Victorian literature? I would love to know and chat below in the comments. I'm actually very new to Victorian literature. The very first Victorian classic I ever read was in 2020 and it was during COVID. And so first of all, I have to say the lockdown actually played a big role in me falling in love with Victorian literature. I remember right before the lockdown, I went to a thrift store and I picked up the very first book that I'm going to talk about. And I don't know why I picked it up because I had never been drawn to Victorian literature. I was always too intimidated and I thought I was frankly too dumb to read classics in general. Up until 2020, I had only read maybe 1 or 2 classics in high school. I think Frankenstein was one of them, and I know I read some Shakespeare plays as well, but I was not well versed in classics at all. And at that point, I also only really read Christian historical romance and Christian fiction, biblical fiction, that kind of thing. So in my head, Miriam is not a classics reader. That was where I was right at the beginning of 2020. And then I picked this book up at the thrift store and I just decided to read it on a whim during the lockdown. And I fell in love and there was no turning back after I read this book. And so I am talking about Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Dickens was no stranger to the pain of hunger and the degradation of poverty. He poured his own youthful experience of Victorian London's unspeakable squalor into this realistic depiction of the link between destitution and crime. A profound social critic, Dickens introduced genteel readers to the problems of the poor in a way that had rarely been attempted before. This tale of the struggle between hope and cruelty continues to speak to modern audiences. I won't be going in depth with these books, but I'm just going to touch on why I loved them and why they definitely played a role in forming me into a Victorian literature lover. So with Oliver Twist, what really captured my heart were the characters. Very iconic and memorable characters. Of course, Oliver Twist, this poor orphan boy. He was definitely a victim of his circumstances and I felt so much compassion for him and sympathy. He truly broke my heart. And we have some amazing side characters as well. We have Nancy, the Artful Dodger, Bill Sikes, Fagin, who was awful. And I had heard about some of these characters and I feel like because Dickens was so prolific, a lot of pop culture references are very Dickensian, and I had heard the name Fagin. I had heard the Artful Dodger. I heard these terms and I had no idea what they referred to. So reading this book, it was just a wonderful experience. I also remember when I first picked it up, I was so intimidated and there were so many words I didn't understand. And I think that's one of the main reasons I was so hesitant to read classics. I felt like because, English class was not my strong suit, I felt like I'm just too dumb for it. But that could not be further from the truth. And if any of you are intimidated by classics because of the wordiness and how verbose they are, and the fact that the English language has changed and it continues to evolve and it may be difficult to read and require more focus, I still think it's so worth your time. But as I was saying, I was so intimidated, and I don't know how well you can see here, but I would circle words that I didn't know and write the definitions by them. And then I also had the Spark Notes summary open as I was reading this. So I would read a chapter, read the summary of it, just to make sure that I was understanding everything that happened. So this book, it truly was my introduction into Victorian literature, and I almost treated it like a project when I read it, but I loved it so much. Even though now I would say Dickens and I have a bit of a love-hate relationship and I don't love all of his books, I do think that his writing in this book, it was exactly what I needed to read at that time. His descriptive writing blew me away, his humor blew me away, and this book truly did elicit a very strong emotional response from me. And I will never forget when I first picked this up, just how much I fell in love with it. Even though it's not an all-time favorite book, it's not like a 5-star absolute favorite, I'm still so happy I read it, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see how there were people in the Victorian era such as Dickens, who had very strong opinions on social inequalities and poverty and crime, and they wrote about those topics, and I love that. Oliver Twist was not the only Charles Dickens book that I read in 2020. I also picked up A Christmas Carol for the very first time and fell in love. This is definitely an all-time favorite Christmas story and one that I will keep returning to. When I read this book for the first time, I was so surprised to see how Victorians could write really great supernatural ghost stories, and I wasn't sure that Dickens would capture the spirit of Christmas in the way that I was hoping he would right before I picked this up, and as someone who adores Christmas so much, I was a little nervous, but he truly does capture the spirit of Christmas, spirit of the season, and he tackles such amazing themes in this book, like greed and charity, generosity, kindness. It teaches very important lessons. Scrooge is such a curmudgeon, but I can't help but adore his character and his character arc. And yeah, I'm so grateful that I read this book, and it definitely made me fall in love with Victorian literature even more. And it also made me want to read more from Charles Dickens, and I think, just over halfway through his list of full-length novels. So very grateful for this book as well. I wanted to mention, I also really love how each of these books, they're very different from each other. So they're 5 very different books, but they all worked to make me fall in love with Victorian literature. And this next one is a shorter work by an all-time favorite author. And just like Oliver Twist, it is not an all-time favorite book. It's not like a 5-star absolute amazing book, but I truly, truly appreciate it. I am talking about The Warden by Anthony Trollope. In this novel, which is Trollope's first acknowledged masterpiece, an emotional drama is staged against the backdrop of 2 major contemporary social issues: the inappropriate use of charitable funds and the irresponsible exercise of the power of the press. A witty love story in the Jane Austen tradition, this is also an unusually subtle example of condition of England fiction, combining its charming portrayal of life in an English cathedral close with a serious engagement in larger social and political issues. This book truly is coziness in a book. It's a book about 2 characters that are very much trying to do what's morally right in their own eyes, and it definitely leads to conflict between the 2 of them. One of the main characters is Septimus Harding, one of my favorite fictional characters of all time, and the other is John Bold, who is in love with Eleanor Harding, Septimus's daughter. So there's definitely conflict there, and as the book mentioned, it is centered around an issue of funding for a charitable hospital or almshouse, that kind of thing. What really stood out to me in this book and made me more curious about Victorian literature is the way that family relationships were described, and I truly fell in love with the way that Septimus and Eleanor's relationship is portrayed. It is such a beautiful father-daughter relationship. It's one of those books where I sat there kind of smiling, just thinking Victorians were exactly the same. We're all the same. Humans have not changed. It also proved to me that books that tackle politics and like church politics and things like that don't have to be as daunting as they may seem to be. And I definitely was a little intimidated because I heard that this entire series, the Barsetshire series, I don't know if I mentioned, it is the first book in the Barsetshire series, and I heard that they deal heavily with church politics, and I was very, very intimidated, but I was not at all confused or intimidated, and it also helps to have a good classic edition. And I've said many times that the Oxford World Classics have amazing explanatory notes, and it just helps so much to understand what's going on in terms of the political side of things. This book also proved to me that classics can be very accessible and easy to read and have lots of humor as well. There's also such an iconic quote from Septimus Harding in this book, and he says, "What on earth could be more luxurious than a sofa, a book, and a cup of coffee?" I so appreciate this book. I really enjoyed it, and it is a short one as well, so it's a really good place to start with Victorian literature as well. That is The Warden by Anthony Trollope. Moving over to a short story collection, and I am not the biggest short story person, but this is a huge exception. And this entire canon is a huge exception. I am talking about The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Oh, how I love Sherlock and Watson, and how I love this collection of short stories. This is the very first collection of stories I read featuring Sherlock, and then I went back after completing this and started from the beginning with the first book, A Study in Scarlet. But this book is what made me fall in love with Sherlock. It's just such a unique collection of short stories. We have murder mysteries, we have theft, and a bunch of other mysteries as well. And it was my introduction, like I said, to Sherlock and Watson as characters as well. And then of course we meet other amazing characters like Irene Adler, Inspector Lestrade, and it's just so fun. I love how friendship is portrayed in this book between Sherlock and Watson. It's just so beautiful. And this book just proved to me that Victorian classics can have a sense of adventure and fun and really get into the morbid, and I just loved it. It's very, very easy to read as well, very accessible. It's a great place to start. If you've never read a Victorian classic, this is a really good place to start because they're all short stories. I believe most, if not all of these stories are also told in the first person narration. So it's from Dr. Watson's perspective, and it just makes for an even easier read as well. And it's just pure fun and humor and adventure. And I'm so, so happy that I read this collection. I love it so much. And last but not least, we have book number 5, and that is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Unlike many people who have started off with Jane Eyre, this was actually the very first Bronte novel that I read out of all the sisters. And I remember the minute that I finished this book, I just stared at it and I didn't know really what to think. I was so shocked almost and just taken aback that this was written in the Victorian era. It took me several days of sitting on my thoughts and really thinking about the story and its themes before I really fully realized just how much I loved the reading experience and how much I loved this book. And I'm hoping to reread it very, very soon. I actually still have a character scheme that I wrote with all the characters in the book, and as I was reading I added to it, and this was so helpful when I read the book because all the characters have the same names. It's a lot. But anyways, this book I also credit with making me fall in love with Victorian literature, specifically Gothic, mysterious Victorian literature. It is a tale like no other. It is a story like no other. It deals with very toxic relationships and consequences of making very, very poor decisions. It's very much a cautionary tale. It's not a romance at all. It's very dismal and bleak, and it's set on the Yorkshire moors, which I love, love, love. And another reason I love this book so much is it made me fall in love with that specific setting. This book is like a train wreck that you can't look away from, but it is just a masterpiece. I love it so much. I kind of had a moment reading this book where I was like, wow, Victorians really felt deeply. Not that I thought they were emotionless people, but it just, I felt so much closer to Emily Bronte as a person, and I felt like she wasn't just this historical figure that wrote great books. She truly felt like a human being with deep thoughts and deep feelings, deep emotions. She did not shy away from some very difficult topics, and I honestly think we would have been great friends had I known her. She feels like a kindred spirit. So all I can say is thank you to Emily Bronte and to Wuthering Heights for making me fall in love with Victorian classics, specifically Gothic Victorian classics. So friends, these are the 5 classics, the 5 Victorian classics that deserve all the credit as to why I love Victorian literature and why I participate in Victober and why I have such a huge collection of Victorian classics and can't stop adding to that collection. Obviously, every Victorian author has a very unique writing style. No author is the same as another, but there's just a quality about Victorian literature and the writing. It feels very, very unique to that time period, and it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's so immersive, and I can't get enough of it, and I don't think I will ever get sick of reading Victorian classics, ever. But that is it for this video. I wanted to share these 5 books and why I love them so much. If any of you watching have never read a Victorian classic, I would highly encourage trying it out. There are so many different genres within Victorian literature that would suit your reading tastes. But that's it for this video, friends. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next Victober video. Bye!